added element of actors' speech duration, translation literalness, and the relationship between the arts of drama and acting. Successful play translators are able to create language that allows the actor and the playwright to work together effectively. Play translators must also take into account several other aspects: the final performance, varying theatrical and acting traditions, characters' speaking styles, modern theatrical discourse, and even the acoustics of the auditorium, i.e., whether certain words will have the same effect on the new audience as they had on the original audience. Audiences in Shakespeare's time were more accustomed than modern playgoers to actors having longer stage time. Modern translators tend to simplify the sentence structures of earlier dramas, which included compound sentences with intricate hierarchies of subordinate clauses. Chinese literature reign. Translating Chinese literature, translators struggle to find true fidelity in translating into the target language. In The Poem Behind the Poem, Barnstone argues that poetry can't be made to sing through a mathematics that doesn't factor in the creativity of the translator. Notable piece of work translated into English is the Wenzhun, an anthology representative of major works of Chinese literature. Translating this work requires a high knowledge of the genres presented in the book, such as poetic forms, various prose types including memorials, letters, proclamations, praise poems, edicts, and historical, philosophical, and political disquisitions, threnodies and laments for the dead, and examination essays. Thus, the literary translator must be familiar with the writings, lives, and thought of a large number of its 130 authors, making the Wenzhun one of the most difficult literary works to translate. Translation generally, much as with Kurt Gödel's conception of mathematics, requires, to varying extents, more information than appears in the page of text being translated. Sung text translation of a text that is sung in vocal music for the purpose of singing in another language, sometimes called singing translation, is closely linked to translation of poetry because most vocal music, at least in the Western tradition, is set to verse, especially verse in regular patterns with rhyme. Since the late 19th century, musical setting of prose and free verse has also been practiced in some art music, though popular music tends to remain conservative in its retention of stanzaic forms with or without refrains. A rudimentary example of translating poetry for singing is church hymns, such as the German chorales translated into English by Catherine Winkworth. Translation of sung texts is generally much more restrictive than translation of poetry, because in the former there is little or no freedom to choose between a versified translation and a translation that dispenses with verse structure. One might modify or omit rhyme in a singing translation, but the assignment of syllables to specific notes in the original musical setting places great challenges on the translator. There is the option in prose sung text, less in verse, of adding or deleting a syllable here and there by subdividing or combining notes, respectively. But even with prose, the process is almost like strict verse translation because of the need to stick as closely as possible to the original prosody of the sung melodic line. Other considerations in writing a singing translation include repetition of words and phrases, the placement of rests and or punctuation, the quality of vowels sung on high notes, and rhythmic features of the vocal line that may be more natural to the original language than to the target language. A sung translation may be considerably or completely different from the original, thus resulting in a counterfactual. Translations of sung text, whether of the above type meant to be sung or of a more or less literal type meant to be read, are also used as aids to audiences, singers and conductors, when a work is being sung in a language not known to them. The most familiar types are translations presented as subtitles or surtitles projected during opera performances, those inserted into concert programs, and those that accompany commercial audio CDs of vocal music. In addition, professional and amateur singers often sing works in languages they do not know or do not know well, and translations are then used to enable them to understand the meaning of the words they are singing. Religious texts. An important role in history has been played by translation of religious texts. Such translations may be influenced by tension between the text and the religious values the translators wish to convey. For example, Buddhist monks who translated the Indian sutras into Chinese occasionally adjusted their translations to better reflect China's distinct culture, emphasizing notions such as filial piety. One of the first recorded instances of translation in the West was the rendering of the Old Testament into Greek in the 3rd century BCE. The translation is known as the Septuagint, a name that refers to the supposedly 70 translators, 72 in some versions, who were commissioned to translate the Bible at Alexandria, Egypt. According to legend, each translator worked in solitary confinement in his own cell, and, according to legend, all 70 versions proved identical. The Septuagint became the source text for later translations into many languages, including Latin, Coptic, Armenian and Georgian. Still considered one of the greatest translators in history for having rendered the Bible into Latin is Jerome, 347–420 CE, the patron saint of translators. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church used his translation, known as the Vulgate, though even this translation stirred controversy. By contrast with Jerome's contemporary, Augustine of Hippo, 354–430 CE, who endorsed precise translation, Jerome believed in adaptation and sometimes invention in order to more effectively bring across the meaning. Jerome's colorful Vulgate translation of the Bible includes some crucial instances of overdetermination. For example, Isaiah's prophecy, announcing that the Savior will be born of a virgin, uses the word Alma, which is also used to describe the dancing girls at Solomon's court, and simply means young and nubile. Jerome, writes Marina Warner, translates it as Virgo, adding divine authority to the virulent cult of sexual disgust that shaped Christian moral theology. The Quran, free from this linguistic trap, does not connect Mary's miraculous nature with moral horror of sex. The apple that Eve offered to Adam, according to Mark Polizzotti, could equally well have been an apricot, orange, or banana, but Jerome liked the pun. Malice, malum, apple, evil. Pope Francis has suggested that the phrase, "Lead us not into temptation," in the Lord's Prayer found in the Gospels of Matthew, the first Gospel, written c. 80–90 CE, and Luke, the third Gospel, written c. 80–110 CE, should more properly be translated, "Do not let us fall into temptation," commenting that God does not lead people into temptation, Satan does. Some important early Christian authors interpreted the Bible's Greek text and Jerome's Latin Vulgate similarly to Pope Francis. A.J.B. Higgins in 1943 showed that among the earliest Christian authors, the understanding and even the text of this devotional verse underwent considerable changes. These ancient writers suggest that, even if the Greek and Latin texts are left unmodified, something like "Do not let us fall" could be an acceptable English rendering. Higgins cited Tertullian, the earliest of the Latin Church Fathers, c. 155 c. 240 CE, "Do not allow us to be led," and Cyprian, c. 200–258 CE, "Do not allow us to be led into temptation." A later author, Ambrose, c. 340–397 CE, followed Cyprian's interpretation. Augustine of Hippo, 354–430, familiar with Jerome's Latin Vulgate rendering, observed that many people say it this way, "and do not allow us to be led into temptation." In 863 CE, the brothers Saints Cyril and Methodius, the Byzantine Empire's apostles to the Slavs, began translating parts of the Bible into the Old Church Slavonic language, using the Glagolitic script that they had devised based on the Greek alphabet. The periods preceding and contemporary with the Protestant Reformation saw translations of the Bible into vernacular, local, European languages, a development that contributed to Western Christianity split into Roman Catholicism and Protestantism over disparities between Catholic and Protestant renderings of crucial words and passages, and due to a Protestant perceived need to reform the Roman Catholic Church. Lasting effects on the religions, cultures, and languages of their respective countries, were exerted by such Bible translations as Martin Luther's into German, the New Testament, 1522, Jakub Wujek's into Polish, 1599, as revised by the Jesuits, and William Tyndale's New Testament, 1526, and revisions, and the King James Version into English, 1611. Efforts to translate the Bible into English had their martyrs. William Tyndale, c. 1494–1536, was convicted of heresy at Antwerp, was strangled to death while tied at the stake, and then his dead body was burned. Earlier, John